It was pretty heavy shadows came over our lives. They all went. They all had to go. You know, they all went one by one. They knew right away that they were going to be involved somehow. Grief doesn't go very far away. You scratch the surface and it's all back again. You see, love is like that. If you love someone, if they're gone for a short while or a long while, that love never goes away.
On the heels of the Great Depression of 1929, troubling currents of fascism began trickling into Europe and Asia. Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising to restore the German people to their rightful place as the master race. Western Europe was overrun by the Nazis. France capitulated. Great Britain struggled to survive the Blitz. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, was defiant.
We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
In collusion with the Nazis, Imperial Japan attacked China and began a campaign to take over Southeast Asia. Few Americans expected them to turn their fury eastward to Hawaii, Alaska, or the U.S. mainland. As fall turned into winter in 1941, explosive conflicts in Europe and Asia seemed worlds away from a quiet mining community in northern Michigan, and a family struggling to make ends meet. The Koskis lived in a small house on a corner lot in West Ishpeming. There were 12 children, 6 girls and 6 boys. Edna May was the youngest.
My mother died just 6 days after I was born. My father was left with 12 children. I was just a baby. My father was very stern, very stoic. I never saw him smile. My father said, if you got any time, let it be to praise God. If you have any time to read anything, let it be the Bible. Nobody went off the straight and narrow that way, because even for us talking about alcohol, he would say, you take a drink of alcohol, you understand, you don't have a home anymore.
It was a ragtag bunch in hand-me-down clothes. They worked hard, played when they had a chance, and took delight in everything the outdoors had to offer.
You could roam the fields. We had a hayloft with 9 cows in the barn. You could jump in the hayloft, especially when you cut hay in July and brought that fresh hay. Just swing on a rope and, great things.
As the boys grew into men, they spent as much time as they could at a ramshackle hunting camp, a 20-mile hike from home. Hunting was a solitary activity, but after dusk, the brothers gathered at camp and swapped stories over steaming mugs of coffee. It was at camp that the Koski brothers first heard of the attack on Pearl Harbor. As one of them later recalled,
we were out at a hunting camp, and somebody had a radio, and they said, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and that's, that was the introduction to the whole thing.
President Roosevelt rallied the country.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
It was struggle for existence. You felt that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and hey, things were serious then. We had no, you were going to fight this war to a finish, that's all. There was no turning back or no questions.
One by one, the Koski brothers left for war. Soon, a flag with 6 stars hung by the door, showing the family had 6 of its sons serving in active duty. George was the first to leave.
My dad went out into the barn, and a car drove up. Brother George got into the car, and the car started going down the road, and I ran, and I was crying and saying, because I loved him. It was morning, but it was very black out.
As Edna May gazed at the tire tracks on the snowy road, she had no way of knowing that all 12 Koski children would never again be together. George was a brilliant student and grew to be a handsome young man in the clean-cut style of the 40s. His sights were set far beyond the small town of West Ishpeming. The war shook George loose from his family ties sooner than expected. George was assigned to the Signal Corps, where troops handled communications and a new technology called radar. His wartime work required clearance from the FBI, and he was always circumspect about it.
Had a lot of interesting things happen since I saw you last, but can't tell you about it now.
Signal Corps infantry sometimes shipped into combat aboard flimsy, engineless gliders that too often broke apart on landing or drifted into posts set out by the enemy. Gliders bounced and jerked behind lumbering C-47 tow planes. Bullets and flak easily tore through the thin plywood or fabric walls. It was a terrifying one-way ride. Most accounts put George aboard a glider during Operation Varsity, one of the biggest airborne operations in military history. The mission was to secure ground for a bridgehead where Allied troops could cross the Rhine River and penetrate into the heart of Nazi territory. Preparations for Operation Varsity did not go unnoticed by the Germans. In her evening propaganda broadcast, Axis Sally, the notorious Nazi mouthpiece, snidely promised a hot reception. As the operation began, more than 1,000 gliders packed with troops gathered into formation with American Dakota aircraft carrying parachute battalions. The formation stretched for nearly 200 miles and took 2.5 hours to pass overhead. 24 hours into Operation Varsity, the mission was declared a success. But many gliders had not made it safely to the ground. George was missing. A few weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Alfred Koski was recalled to active duty with the Coastal Artillery. His young wife, Jeanette, saw him off at the train station. Al was the oldest Koski brother. Stern beyond his years, he had spent most of his life conscientiously watching over his younger siblings.
I think he wanted to take some of the responsibility from my father for raising us. So he was very, very strict with us.
Al's wartime letters to his brothers show keen insight into the scars combat can leave on the soul as well as on the body.
I'm sure glad to hear from you, and it is comforting to know you are physically still intact, though spiritually we all suffer wounds that will stay with us to our graves. Sometimes and often lately I wonder if one is capable of enjoying and receiving pleasure from the same things we used to during our normal course of life.
Alfred was stationed on a tiny island halfway down the Aleutian Island chain off the coast of Alaska. His job was to survey potential sites for anti-aircraft emplacements around Dutch Harbor, an isolated outpost protecting Alaska, Western Canada, and Washington State. News and communications from the Aleutian Islands were heavily censored.
It is hard to write. Things which would be of interest are forbidden.
6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, waves of Japanese Zeros strafed the Dutch harbor docks while bombers targeted ships, barracks, and planes. Al was blown into the icy water as thick pillars of smoke began to rise from nearby oil storage tanks. The attack on Dutch Harbor was the first salvo of a Japanese attempt to take the Aleutian Islands. Their strategy was to use the islands as stepping stones for an invasion of North America. Japanese and American troops battled in harsh Arctic conditions. Casualties were heavy. After the attack on Dutch Harbor, weeks went by without any word from Al. His name was Carl Arthur Koski, but everyone called him Art. His grandson remembers him.
I think of a man who was the kindest, gentlest, most giving man I've ever known, or I think ever will know. He was a man who believed in objective truth. Right was right and wrong was wrong. He came from a time when a lot more people, it seems to me, understood that and believed it.
Art reported to the induction center in Milwaukee. He passed the physical and was sent directly to basic training with the 332nd Engineers at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Art wrote a steady stream of letters to his girlfriend Jeanette and generously offered to let her use his shotgun if she went hunting.
Wonder who will be lucky enough to do any hunting this fall. Say, if you intend to go out by yourself this fall, you're welcome to use my shotgun.
Like every GI with a girl back home, Art missed Jeanette and tried in his own way to reassure her.
Hunting men is a lot like hunting deer. The enemy will be dead before they know I'm anywhere around. If it comes to fighting, they won't have anything to say, 'cause I think there's more hell in me than a dozen other soldiers put together. I hope.
Art's unit shipped out to England, where they set to work building airstrips and bases for Allied battalions gathered for the coming invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. Art's unit arrived on Utah Beach soon after D-Day to clear the wreckage of war from nearby Cherbourg, the French port that would become critical for supplying the Allied push through Europe and onto Berlin. Art was part of a team that worked its way through France and into Belgium, surveying and repairing badly damaged railroad tracks and bridges. On Christmas Eve 1944, Art and the other enlisted men received an invitation to dine in a railroad car used as their mobile headquarters and usually reserved for officers. It was a fleeting moment of peace amidst one of the longest and bloodiest battles between Americans and Germans, the Battle of the Bulge. Just 9 days before Christmas, German panzer divisions broke through Allied defenses in a last-ditch gamble to reach Liege and restock their critically low fuel supplies. In the first 3 days of battle, 2 American regiments were forced to surrender. Casualties mounted. The situation became desperate. Art and another soldier were ordered to blockade one of the secondary roads leading to Liege. Suddenly, Art was on the front lines. It was bitterly cold. Art carried his rifle and a few grenades. He had no idea what might come down the road. But even if it was a column of German panzers, Art knew it was his job to stop them. Oskar Koski reported for duty in 1943 and became a B-17 navigator. He shipped out overseas to a small airfield in Italy, where he joined the 301st Bomb Group. Oskar cloaked a deep-seated seriousness with a carefully polished veneer of flippancy. Soon after arriving in Italy, he wrote,
I thought Hitler would certainly surrender as soon as he heard I arrived here, but obviously he's crazier than I thought.
Oskar's slightly irreverent attitude toward authority even poked fun at the U.S. Air Force.
In case you don't know, the FO stands for Flight Officer, quite a special case, as it is generally understood to mean something else. In the case of the Air Corps, it is synonymous to anything and everything which ails this most commendable organization.
Oskar quickly got into the daily rhythm of briefings and missions.
Then you went down to the briefing hut, and there was a big screen, and they had it covered. You couldn't ever tell what mission you were going to fly. And then they rolled up the screen when they were ready to take an or present the mission to, and then you see the line going up to whatever target, and then there'd be people gasping, oh, Vienna again, or something like that. And then we'd gather our flight gear in our bags and be transported out to the airplanes. Generally, they'd wait to have a signal when you're ready to start the engines.
Some missions were easy milk runs. On others, planes encountered heavy resistance from anti-aircraft fire and German fighters. B-17 pilots grimly flew into clouds of flak, unable to take any defensive action until they had dropped their bombs on the target. Shrapnel tore through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. Explosions buffeted the plane from every side. On the worst missions, hundreds of young airmen went down with their planes. Those who returned safely somehow had to muster courage to climb into their planes again the next day. Airmen coped with combat anxiety in various ways. In letters home, Oscar tried to joke about harrowing missions, but his tortured handwriting reveals plenty of emotional distress.
I suppose you heard that American flyers raided Vienna on November 19th. Well, it may please you to know, at least as much as it displeases me, that I was there bouncing flak fragments off the instrument panel.
And then came the terrifying mission over Czechoslovakia.
I think we were bombing a oil refinery in Brest, Czechoslovakia. The Germans, sneaky devils, had run a flak train in, and bang, out goes number 2. They had a good sight on us. So we had number 2 and 3 out, and number 4 was always sort of questionable, and number 1 was running fine. So it was a certainty that we were going to go down.
Reuben Koski grew up with an appreciation for hard work. Early in the war, Reuben received deferments. As a miner, his work was essential to the war effort. 85% of the iron ore used by the United States for guns, tanks, and ships during World War II came from mines in the Lake Superior region. As the war dragged on into its 4th year, America needed soldiers and sailors more than it needed iron. Reuben's deferments were withdrawn, and he headed to the Great Lakes Naval Base near Chicago for basic training. The U.S. Navy was preparing for an invasion of Japan. Despite upbeat U.S. propaganda, an invasion of the Japanese mainland was expected to be a titanic struggle, leaving millions dead. Allied military planners based casualty estimates on the Battle of Okinawa, where Japanese soldiers fought savagely and used civilians as human shields. When the battle neared its end, fanatical Japanese commanders convinced civilians that U.S. soldiers would go on a rampage of killing and raping. Thousands of women and children committed suicide. They had seen Japanese atrocities and falsely expected American soldiers to behave in the same way. The Japanese war machine was brutal. Reuben and other cadets at the Great Lakes Naval Base were training to face it down. John was the youngest boy in the Koski family. He was a serious child and a bit shy, especially around girls. At school, he picked up a love for poetry.
Yes, Johnny loved poetry, but we all did also. In school, everyone had to learn poetry, a lot of poetry. And so he recited poetry, and especially the poem about I Have a Rendezvous with Death.
I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade when spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air. John admired his older brothers and tried to gain their approval by developing skills in hunting and woodcraft. When his brothers shipped out to war, John longed to follow them. Too young to enlist, John prepared for war in his own way. He and a high school friend practiced close-order drills in a nearby field. He scribbled a caption on this photo: "Two generals meet." After graduation, John tried to enlist, but almost a year passed before he was called to duty. It was fall of 1944 and late in the war. John began to think fighting would be over before he finished basic training.
It seems funny to think that already 5 weeks of my basic training have passed, and it seems only yesterday that I left home. According to what one guy said over the radio, Germany will be out of the war by Labor Day. I sure do hope it'll be over with Japan, too. Maybe then I could be home for deer season.
Instead of heading home, John was sent to Europe as a replacement for one of the many soldiers killed or wounded in battle. He was assigned to a mortar squad of the celebrated 10th Mountain Infantry Division. The tide of battle had turned in favor of the Allies, but remnants of the German army stubbornly continued to fight. In the mountains of Italy, seasoned German troops held positions near the Gothic line. The 10th Mountain Infantry Division fought for every inch of every hill. The men of F Company vividly recall the struggle.
In my mind's eye, that happened yesterday.
You could smell the death right in your breath. You could smell it.
The Germans were looking right down on you, and you're walking uphill right toward them. Not too good.
The whole mountainside went up in flames.
The Germans knew exactly where we were. They'd been there. They'd had that mountain.
Well, the Germans found out about us and shelled us, and we took major casualties in that trough that was in there.
Like a bad dream. I dreamed of it for years afterwards.
As the war wound down, the Sons in Service flag outside the Koski house displayed 6 stars. 6 blue stars for 6 men valiantly serving their country. On April 15th, 1 blue star turned gold. A few short weeks before the unconditional surrender of all German forces, one of the Koski boys was killed in action. Edna May remembers the day she heard about her brother's death.
It was May 4th, 1945. I was in school, and the teacher had written on the board the poem Flanders Field. And I got up to sharpen my pencil. We didn't have pens back then or anything, just pencils. And I looked out of the school window, and there was my brother-in-law, Jack Bennett, coming up the sidewalk. His car was parked on the end, on the street, and he was walking up the curved driveway to the West Ishmael School. And I thought, oh, he must have had to go to work early that day, and he wanted me to babysit. I looked at the watch, and it was 10:30. And he came to the schoolroom door, and Mrs. Lindholm was our teacher, and she went to answer the door. And she turned to me and said, you better take your books and papers. You won't be back for a while. And I said, what happened? And she said, your brother was killed in the war. But she didn't say which one.
At home, the news shattered emotions already strained by apprehension and constant worry. Eleanor poured out her feelings in letters to the surviving brothers.
I feel as though my faith in God is tottering in its weakness. The very sight of my friends, or the thought of any recreation, nauseates me, and if I had my way, I would hide away forever and wait for the day that I could see my brother again.
Many of the fallen were laid to rest near the fields in which they fought. Others were transported home to lie in family plots with simple headstones commemorating their service.
It was November 16th. It was snowing. It was early in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning. And the 400 came in from Chicago. I was coming from the west up to the railroad station. 4 soldiers stepped off from the train. They came over and saluted us. And one of the men said, I have a message, and it is this. He said to tell his family that he died a Christian, a believer in Jesus Christ.
Memories of the fallen still haunt those who survive.
He had cleaned his gun, and then he came and he gave me a watch. And he said, take care of this for me. And my house burned down in 1980, but I believe I still have this watch. He said, keep it for me.
Wars are often won by the people who wish most to forget them, by soldiers and families whose sacrifices, struggles, and triumphs are all an attempt to create a world in which such efforts are not needed, by brave men and women who may not seek conflict, but who will not shy away when it is thrust upon them. In World War II, a generation of Americans was called to fight Nazi and imperial armies marching ominously through Europe and Asia. Millions of American families sent their sons into battle. Hundreds of thousands never came home. What remains is their legacy. For their descendants, it is a reminder of the high cost of freedom.
Right is still right, wrong is still wrong. And despite the messages that you may hear from some people, we are a land that does not go to war because we like it. We do not go to war because we want to. We go to war because right is still right and wrong is still wrong. And there are some things worth fighting for.